There's a temple in Egypt that sits in the wrong place. Not by a few meters, the entire mountain it was carved into, 4 colossal statues, halls running deep into solid rock, every wall of it, stands 65 meters higher than where it stood for 3,000 years. Because in the 1960s, engineers did something that still sounds like a dare. They took one of the most precious monuments on Earth, drew a grid of lines across the faces of its gods, and cut the whole thing into more than 1,000 pieces. Then they carried it up a cliff, block by block, and put it back together like the world's heaviest puzzle. They had no choice. The water was coming, and it wasn't going to wait. Here's what makes this story worth the next 20 minutes of your life. It's not just that ancient people carved this temple out of a mountain with bronze tools and got its astronomy so precise it still works as a calendar. It's what happened when modern engineers, with cranes and the best minds of 50 nations, tried to match that precision. Stay with me to the end, because the final detail of this story is the part nobody sees coming. And once you hear it, you won't think about primitive, ancient builders the same way again. This is Abu Simbel, the temple that was saved by being destroyed. Go back 33 centuries to the southern edge of ancient Egypt. This is Nubia, hard desert, black rock, and the Nile cutting through it like a green wire. It's the frontier. Beyond here, Egypt's power fades into someone else's. And that's exactly why Ramses II chose it. Ramses wasn't a modest man. He ruled for 66 years. He fathered around 100 children. He stamped his name on more stone than any pharaoh before or after him. But at Abu Simbel, around 1264 BC, he ordered something different from another statue or another temple wall. He pointed at a sandstone cliff above the river and told his builders to turn the mountain itself into a message. Not a temple built in front of the mountain, a temple carved into it. The facade, the giants guarding it, the pillared halls, the sanctuary, all of it would be the mountain, hollowed and shaped from the living rock, the same way Kailasa would be cut in India 5 centuries later. And the message was simple. Every trader, every soldier, every Nubian chief coming down the Nile toward Egypt would round the bend of the river and see 4 seated colossi staring down at them, each one over 20 meters tall, each one the same face, his. Sit with that for a second. This is a billboard from 1264 BC. It's the size of a 7-story building, and it still works. You round that bend today and your stomach still drops. Now look closer at what his workers actually pulled off. Sandstone sounds soft, and compared to granite, it is. But nobody carves a 20-meter seated figure out of a cliff by being gentle. You get one mountain, one face of rock, and no way to patch a mistake. Sound familiar? It's the same unforgiving rule that governed every rock-cut monument in history. Subtraction only. What you remove never comes back. The workers cut the cliff back into a sloped facade about 30 meters tall and 35 wide. They freed 4 colossal figures from the rock, seated, hands on knees, crowned. They carved the king's family standing at his shins, full-sized human statues that barely reached the giant's knees. Then they went inward. Behind the facade, they hollowed the mountain into a sequence of chambers running roughly 60 meters deep. An entrance hall held up by 8 pillars, each one carved as Ramses again, arms crossed like Osiris. Storerooms, a second hall, and at the very end, the sanctuary, a small dark room with 4 seated figures cut from the rock wall itself. Ra-Horakhti, god of the rising sun. Amun-Ra, king of the gods. Ramses himself, seated among them as an equal, of course. And on the far left, Ptah, god of the underworld, god of darkness. Remember Ptah, he matters in a minute. The deeper you walk, The lower the ceilings get, the smaller the doorways, the darker the air. The architecture is squeezing you, on purpose, from the blazing Nubian sun into the private darkness of the gods. How do you even carve something like this? Not from the bottom, and not from scaffolding poles. The most likely answer is sand. The workers piled enormous ramps of it against the cliff and carved the giants from the top down, lowering the sand as they finished each stage. Crown first, then the face, then the shoulders, working downward with copper and bronze chisels, dolerite pounders and wooden mallets, in heat that regularly passes 40 degrees. When the last of the sand was cleared away, the giants were simply there, as if they'd been sitting inside the cliff all along, waiting. And Ramses wasn't finished. 100 meters away, he ordered a second temple cut into the rock, this one for his favorite wife, Nefertari. On its facade, her statue stands the same height as his. In Egypt, where queens were usually carved knee-high beside their kings, that was almost scandalous. Whatever else he was, the man knew how to make stone talk. And at the very back of the great temple, deep inside the mountain, in a room that daylight should never touch, the builders did something that had nothing to do with sculpture. Twice a year, something happens at Abu Simbel that people now fly around the world to watch. Around the 22nd of February, and again in late October, the sunrise lines up exactly with the temple's axis. Light enters the doorway, crosses the first hall, threads the second, passes the vestibule, and reaches the sanctuary, 60 meters deep in solid rock. That's the length of an Olympic pool, in total darkness, and the beam finds its way to the far wall. For about 20 minutes, it lands on the seated statues at the back. It lights Amun-Ra, it lights Ra-Horakhti, it lights Ramses, glowing between the gods like he planned it, because he did. And Ptah, the god of darkness, sitting right beside them? The light never touches him. Think about what that requires. No optical instruments, no printed star tables. To make a sunbeam arrive in a specific room on a specific morning, the builders had to know the sun's path along the horizon across the whole year, pick their 2 dates, and then align the entire axis through solid rock to an accuracy of fractions of a degree before the first cut was made. Aim a mountain, in other words. Get it slightly wrong at the doorway, and by the far wall, the beam is lighting empty stone. Why those dates? Many scholars link them to the king's coronation and his birthday. The sun crowning Ramses twice a year, forever. Honestly, we can't be fully certain what the dates meant. What we're certain of is the aim. It worked, year after year, without missing, for longer than most civilizations have existed. Hold on to that. 30 centuries of perfect attendance. It's about to matter. Empires don't die loudly at the frontier. They just stop sending people. Egypt's power faded. The priests left. And then the desert came for the temple. Not with violence, but with patience. Year after year, the wind carried sand across Nubia and laid it against the facade. 1 grain means nothing. 1,000 mean almost nothing. But give the wind a few centuries, and the drift starts to climb. First, the giants' feet disappeared, then their laps, then their shoulders, until only 4 enormous heads still broke the surface, staring out over the river like men drowning very, very slowly in the desert. The temple wasn't destroyed. It was hidden. While it slept under the dunes, Rome rose and fell. Whole religions were born not far from here, and the halls inside stayed sealed, hot and still, exactly as the last priest left them. In 1813, a Swiss traveler named Johann Ludwig Burckhardt came down the Nile in local dress, mapping what he could. He nearly walked past it. What stopped him was that row of giant stone heads rising out of a dune. It took 4 more years, and another larger-than-life character, the circus strongman turned tomb hunter Giovanni Belzoni, before anyone shifted enough sand to squeeze through the top of the doorway. The men who first crawled in found the pillars of Ramesses waiting in the dark, untouched, and the sunbeam was still keeping its appointments. Nobody had watched it for centuries. It hadn't missed one. Quick pause here, because the story is about to flip completely. Everything so far, the giants, the sunbeam, the sand, was the ancient half. What comes next is the modern half, and honestly, it's the more unbelievable one. If stories like this are your thing, subscribe now, because this channel lives exactly here, where ancient engineering meets questions we still can't answer. Okay, back to the Nile, because something is about to go very wrong with the water. In the 1950s, Egypt decided to tame the Nile. The plan was the Aswan Dam, a wall across the river that would end the yearly floods, power the country, and create one of the largest artificial lakes on Earth. For a young nation, it meant electricity, farmland, and a future. It also meant that everything upstream would go underwater. Villages, ancient forts, whole stretches of Nubian history, and, sitting right in the flood zone, Abu Simbel. Do the math, and it gets brutal. Lake Nasser would rise roughly 60 meters over the temple's ground. The giants, the halls, the sanctuary, the sunbeam, all of it would sit at the bottom of a lake, dissolving. Sandstone doesn't argue with water. It melts like sugar, slowly. Here's the part that still feels strange to say out loud. The temple had outlasted invading armies, the collapse of its own civilization, and 20 centuries of sand. The thing that finally threatened to erase it was progress. A country doing something reasonable. In 1960, UNESCO put out a call it had never made before. Help us save Nubia. 50 countries answered, in the middle of the Cold War, with money and engineers and surveyors. 24 monuments were eventually taken apart and moved. Some traveled farther than anyone imagined. The little temple of Dendur was crated up, shipped across the Atlantic, and today it stands inside the Metropolitan Museum in New York. But Abu Simbel was the monster of the list. You can crate a small shrine. You cannot crate a mountain. The proposals that came in sound like science fiction. An underwater viewing dome, so tourists in submerged galleries could watch the drowned giants. A single colossal concrete raft, lifting the entire hill on hydraulic jacks, a few millimeters a day, for years. Each scheme was studied seriously, costed seriously, and rejected. Too fragile, too slow against the rising water, too expensive even for 50 nations. The plan they finally chose was somehow the most audacious one. Cut the temple apart, carry it uphill, rebuild the mountain. Between 1964 and 1968, Abu Simbel became the strangest construction site on Earth. First, they built a cofferdam to hold back the rising lake because the water wasn't waiting for anyone. Then they did something that sounds absurd until you understand it. They buried the giants again. On purpose, thousands of tons of sand piled back against the facade, a cushion so the machines working above wouldn't scar the faces below. And then came the part that made grown engineers sick to their stomachs. The temple had to be cut into blocks light enough to lift, up to about 30 tons each. More than 1,000 pieces from the carved surfaces of the 2 temples alone. And every cut had to go somewhere, through a crown, along a jawline, across the face of a god that a sculptor had finished by hand 32 centuries earlier. Power saws were too violent for the carved surfaces. So, for the faces, men knelt with hand saws and cut through ancient stone a few millimeters at a time, keeping each seam thinner than a finger, under 8 millimeters, so the joints could later disappear. Sit with that image. A man with a handsaw, sweating over the eye of Ramses, knowing that one slip becomes permanent damage to one of the most famous faces in human history. The ancient sculptors couldn't undo their mistakes. Now, 3,000 years later, neither could the rescuers. The mountain's one rule had outlived everyone. There was another problem nobody talks about. The sandstone was weak. Millennia of desert weathering had left parts of it ready to crumble at a touch. So before a single saw bit in, workers drilled fine holes and injected synthetic resin deep into the stone, hardening it from the inside, and set thousands of steel anchor bars to give each future block a skeleton. Only then did the cutting begin. Every block got a code painted on its side, its position logged in a master register. Ask anyone from that team what the job felt like, and the answers circle the same word: fear. Not of the lifting, of the cutting. Cranes they trusted. Nobody had ever trusted a saw against the face of a god. Block by block, the pieces went uphill by truck and settled into a numbered storage yard, 65 meters above the old site and about 200 meters back from the water. Crews rebuilt the temple exactly as it was. Then they built a new mountain over it, a huge, hollow concrete dome, one of the largest ever made at the time, buried under rock and sand so that visitors would still walk into a cliff, not a museum. 4 years, roughly 3,000 workers, around $40 million, and at the end of it, the giants sat looking out over a lake that now covered their old home. The joints on the faces are so fine that most visitors never spot them. By almost every measure, it's the greatest rescue in the history of archaeology. Almost. Because there was one thing the modern world couldn't put back. Remember the sunbeam. The engineers knew it was the temple's soul, and they fought to keep it. They rebuilt the axis with survey instruments the ancient builders could not have dreamed of, oriented the whole monument to the same horizon, and waited for February. The light still comes. It still crosses those 60 meters of darkness. It still finds the kings and gods at the back, and it still leaves Ta sitting in shadow. But it arrives a day late. The alignment dates shifted by roughly 1 day and stayed shifted. Move a temple up a cliff and back from the river, change its relationship to the horizon by a fraction, and the sky notices. With 20th century technology, a 50-nation team and $40 million, we rebuilt everything the ancients made. Everything except their precision. Their aim, set with shadows, chords, and patience, was finer than ours. That's the detail I can't shake, and it's why this place belongs in this series. Abu Simbel is 2 impossible feats stacked on one mountain. Ancient builders who aimed a sunbeam through a mountain and hit a date on the calendar, forever. And modern builders who did something just as unthinkable. Cutting a sacred mountain into 1,000 pieces and resurrecting it. And who, at the very last step, came in 1 day behind men who worked in linen kilts with bronze tools. Neither feat diminishes the other. Honestly, they need each other. Without the rescue, the lake erases everything, and this video doesn't exist. Without the ancient precision, there's nothing worth moving a mountain for. The giants sit where we put them now, watching a lake instead of a river. Twice a year, the sun still walks into the mountain to crown a king who's been dead for 3,000 years. Just one sunrise later than he ordered. And maybe that's the real legacy of this place. 2 generations of engineers who would never meet, never speak, and never know each other's names, solved 2 impossible problems for the same monument. One carved the mountain, the other refused to let it drown. So tell me in the comments, which one impresses you more? The men who aimed the mountain, or the men who moved it. And if you want the next impossible place we're cutting into, it's already on the channel. Subscribe, and I'll see you inside the next mountain.